Rayna's mind raced, trying to think of some way to overcome the Greatswords. It was impossible. They were proven veterans. They had seen everything. They were ready for any trick, and they were armed to the teeth. What could he possibly do to throw them off their stride, to shock them?
Baby, don't you know it? I'm hardly heroic. Baby, let's roll it, 'cause I'm hardly heroic.
The year is 2010. I've just walked into my friendly local game store, looking for something to help my tabletop performance. My Empire army has been taking a beating recently. I have some guns and plenty of state troops, but the state troops are often getting torn to pieces well before I can line up the pieces on anything else. Then I see this box, and everything clicks into place. Greatswords. Empire Greatswords. I see the box, and I know what needs to be done. Many years later, they remain my favorite unit in the entire army. So this video is going to be about looking at Imperial Greatswords, their history, their inspirations, and a bit about how they are used. Since Warhammer Fantasy is officially dead, at least until the Old World comes out, I will be drawing upon previous editions of Warhammer Fantasy. I plan on making this a regular series, so please feel free to comment what unit you'd like me to do a deep dive on next. So the Empire is a big place. Normally under the control of a central emperor, the political reality of the Empire's many fractious provinces is that the local count is often the ruling authority, at least insofar as their borders can be protected. The Empire is also unusual in the sense that they maintain standing armies. Each count is obliged to maintain a full-time professional army who can be supplemented by additional specialty forces as needed. Together, all of them combine into a larger imperial army that can protect the borders of the Empire as a whole. Imperial Greatswords are a specific formation of the Imperial Army, and they are the pinnacle of what a normal soldier can achieve. Any soldier who has proved their valor and skill can be promoted to join the ranks of the Greatswords, and in doing so will join the premier elite heavy infantry in the Empire. Greatswords are armored in the finest plate armor, usually forged by expert dwarven smiths from within the Empire itself, and armed with their iconic two-handed greatswords that are equally capable of felling beasts or knights in combat. Greatswords also, importantly, swear oaths to never retreat from the enemy, and they are renowned for their valor. The life of a greatsword is both glamorous and dangerous. They will eat the best food, live in the best quarters, and be paid double wages. Electoral counts know the value of such soldiers and are also hesitant to throw them into the battle on a whim. However, the Greatswords are not powdered dandies. They know that they are the elite of the army, and while they won't be wasted, their lives may need to be spent to secure victory, a price that they will readily pay. My unit of Greatswords, the Middenheim Greatswords, have never once let me down in battle. They were once surrounded on all sides by lizardmen and died up to a man holding their position. They always either die to a man or survive the battle. They've never once actually run away on me. For their valor, they are definitely the most prestigious unit in my army, and they have received the most attention of any of the units in the army definitely over the years. So now that we know what Greatswords are, I think it's time to talk about where they come from. It's no secret that Games Workshop draws upon history for their setting. The Empire is essentially what if the Holy Roman Empire was somehow both more and less dysfunctional, and also periodically a guy with fire for hair can show up and throw a fireball. While Warhammer Fantasy has existed since 1983, Greatswords show up in Warhammer Fantasy 4th edition. In fact, 4th edition is when Games Workshop introduced the idea of separate faction-specific army books for all of the factions in the game. The Empire 4th edition army book detailed the various types of soldiers that could be found in the Imperial Army at the time. These are actually extremely different to what we might imagine today. Firstly, Greatswords don't have superior stats to a normal soldier. The baseline, spearman, and Greatsword models both share the same stats. In fact, the Swordsman unit have one better weapon skill than Greatswords do, which is quite surprising. So, Greatswords are, for all intents and purposes, normal soldiers with two-handed swords. What's most interesting about them, to me at least, is that the Greatsword units don't have any armor. That's right, they don't come with any armor by default. The unit that we're used to thinking of as the premier heavy infantry unit don't even have an armor save in this edition. In fact, they can buy light armor for 2 points. Imagine that. In a weird sort of way, the greatswords depicted here are actually not too far away from their Landsknecht inspirations. If the Empire is based on the Holy Roman Empire, then the Imperial Army is largely based on the military system of that time, including, of course, the Landsknechts, who were famous mercenaries of the era. They had a reputation for their flamboyant uniforms, and some of their soldiers wielded two-handed swords, the Doppel soldiers. Although there's much scholarly debate about the use of the Zweihander, which is the two-handed sword, by Doppelsoldner, especially when dealing with enemy pikemen, they are frequently depicted in art from the period. The Brotherhood of St. Mark, a fencing guild from Germany, had a monopoly on training people on the use of the Zweihander, so clearly it was important at the time. If you look at artwork of Landsknechts, especially from the period, you might be surprised to find a dearth of armor. Despite their professions and its apparent dangers, Landsknechts are not always depicted wearing lots of armor. Some people might be quite well armored, but oftentimes they're wearing relatively light or minimal armor, certainly a far cry from the later editions of Warhammer. Therefore, despite being very different from the greatswords of later editions, these ones are surprisingly in line with their historical counterparts. By the 6th edition of the Empire Army Book, the modern greatswords form as we understand them today. By now, greatswords are generally better than the common state troops, and they're also armored in their now famous full-plate armor. Benefiting from better weapon skill, leadership, and the stubborn special rule, greatswords are now in their position to be the most elite infantry in a standard Empire army. To further reflect this, in the 6th edition book at least, only a single unit of greatswords can be taken in the entire army. In some ways, greatswords are a direct copy of ideas about famous historical soldiers, but in other ways they're quite distinct. In real life, the Landsknechts were notorious for their unreliability, especially if they were unpaid. Greatswords, by contrast, are sworn to serve at the risk of death and dishonor. They're full-time professionals retained as part of a standing army, which is quite different from their historical counterparts. Modern greatswords are essentially fully armored and fight together in a large unit, unlike Doppel soldiers, who historically would have been maybe one in every fourth man in a unit, if that at all. The idea that greatswords are used as bodyguards is a theme shared between them and reality, as historically there was an association between the use of two-handed swords for bodyguarding work. But, of course, the greatswords are that idea taken to 11. Instead of maybe one man with some armor and a greatsword, instead you have a whole regiment of them who are designed to protect important figures on the battlefield. Greatswords as a unit on the battlefield are quite well matched with their lore. Because of their armor and high leadership, you can count on them to hold the line and anchor your battle line against very formidable enemy attacks. Their great weapons also allow them to pose a threat to tough or heavily armored foes, like trolls or chaos warriors. They make for ideal bodyguards as well, if you need to shepherd a captain or a general. I use them often to hold a captain with a battle standard, making them even more resilient. Another alternative is to include a warrior priest in the unit if you want them to be more attack-focused, as they benefit from the priest's hatred special rule that allows them to reroll. In summary, greatswords are a fantastic unit. They are a great example of how to take historical ideas and integrate them into a fantasy setting like Warhammer. They are a unit that is both iconic and useful, equally at home on your parade diorama as they are on the field. If you treat them right, they'll serve you well, as Sigmar intended.